Hello and welcome back to episode 243 of the Ideal Nutrition podcast. My name is Torwen and I'm joined today by my co-host Aidan, and we are going to be talking about electrolyte supplements and giving our thoughts on whether you really need them. Now this episode is super relevant. I'm not sure if everyone has seen the electrolyte trends that are happening at the moment where people wake up, they take an electrolyte supplement and they push it as in this is what you need. So we want to break that down and give our thoughts on, is this necessary?
So electrolytes are sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And one thing we were kind of debating is how deep we go on each of them in terms of what they are and what the role of them in the body is. So obviously before these podcasts, we do prep, right? And we were like, one of the things we wrote down to go away and prep on our own is like, what they are, what's the role? And like, it's just endless. Hey, like there is that cliche of like with magnesium, it's involved in over 300 functions in the body. So if we just say like, what's the role in the body? Endless list. We might do like a streamlined version of that. So I'm going to start with sodium. We might go back and forth. So sodium plays a role in fluid balance. It helps us hold on to water. High sodium pulls water out of the cells and into the bloodstream. And this is also how it raises blood pressure. It also plays a bunch of other roles in things like muscle contractions and nutrient absorption as well. If levels in the blood get too high, the kidneys excrete more of it. If they get too low, the kidneys resorb more. Antidiuretic hormone regulates water retention to dilute sodium if needed as well. One of the reasons why I think it's worth talking about that whole like role in the body and stuff like that is that last bit I was referring to is actually kind of relevant to this discussion, being like, if things get too high, something happens. If things get too low, something happens, to kind of regulate a bit of a balance there.
Cool. So let's chat about, I'll do potassium then. So potassium works with sodium to help regulate fluid balance. It also supports muscle contractions, including in your heart. And there are many food sources we can get it from. People talk about bananas, we talk about potatoes, spinach, kiwi, some dairy, legumes, things like that as well. Most people get enough adequate intake through their diet, but some people also don't.
Most people get enough adequate intake?
I was actually meant to say adequate intake is close to 2,600 to 3,400 milligrams a day. Some people meet these target, but a lot of people don't as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's quite a common one that people fall short on. It is interesting because like I'm a big like proponent of like people should increase their potassium intake. It's hard to make like strong arguments for that. I do have one hot take I'll chuck out there, that increasing potassium intake has more of an effect on reducing blood pressure in those who have high blood pressure than reducing sodium does. Everyone talks about sodium. Very few people talk about increasing potassium, but it is more impactful based on what the research shows. Magnesium. So as I said, involved in so many things. Little fun fact for you, 50 to 60% of it is stored in the bones. So I think that's interesting, but it would be a very long list to go through everything. So instead, I'm just going to do a short version, which is that it plays a role in energy production, muscle relaxation, nerve function, calming the brain, which is also how it helps with like sleep and stuff as well. Bone health, obviously, because so much is in the bone, and also glucose metabolism.
Cool. And then calcium is the last one that we're going to talk about. And that again helps with bone health, can help with muscle contractions, nerve signaling, blood clotting. And yeah, mainly found in dairy foods. You can also find them in fortified plant milks, things like that, sardines, anything with little bones in it, tofu, leafy greens, that sort of thing.
Now, when it comes to supplements versus food, I think it's worth knowing how much is in each. So we're going to go through one by one again. I think this suddenly starts getting a bit more interesting. So we're going to talk about sodium. So the average person eats an estimated 3,800 milligrams of sodium per day. You could obviously debate that kind of stat, whether it's higher, whether it's lower. It's based on like self-reported data. I actually think that that's a pretty like good consensus. That's around 3,800 milligrams per day. That probably means nothing in isolation until you factor in that most guidelines recommend less than 2,300 milligrams per day. It's obviously possible to go too low sodium. Very few people need to worry about it. Athletes obviously can have higher needs though. It's often found in packaged foods. You can literally just read the label and see how much it is. These numbers now have context. And there is a small amount in natural foods. A little funny one I'll chuck in there. So in my acute weight cut plans, I previously, and this is for people like trying to drop weight for competition, I'd often recommend like low sodium 2 days out or something like that. And in my old plans, I used to like set a target that's like, try to have like less than 300 milligrams of sodium per day or something like super low. And then another dietitian on our team was like, once you factor in how much is in like natural foods, it's incredibly difficult to like stay below that low of a target. And I've looked into it and I'm like, yeah, that's actually like a fair criticism. And now I've just said, basically try to avoid as much as you can. But there is a small amount that is in natural foods and it's worth factoring that in. And of course, like adding it to food, like through like just adding salt is a factor as well. Theoretically, if somebody only ate home cooked food and they never added salt, going too low could be an issue. It just seems incredibly rare. So anyway, average person, 3,800 milligrams per day. Torwen, how much do supplements often add?
This is an interesting one because it can vary between the two. So let's take, for example, something like a Gatorade, which has 300 milligrams of sodium. Should we chat about what else is in those ones as well, or let's just chat sodium?
Let's just do sodium.
Let's just do sodium. So 300 milligrams in a standard Gatorade. A Hydrolyte tablet, a singular one, might have 140 milligrams of sodium. Higher electrolyte supplements, things like Sodi, might have 1,000 milligrams of sodium. Did you mention, just on the side as well, that's the same as a My Muscle Chef meal, which is crazy.
Yeah, so I haven't used it. So I haven't used that in this one, but I do talk about that a bit. So like I often point to, so most My Muscle Chef meals would be quite high, but like the first one I picked up when I was going to use an example was the Chipotle chicken one, and it has 1,600 milligrams of sodium. So it's like you literally just like grab this thing, 1,600 milligrams, versus even like these super high ones like Sodi or Element. Like the highest I often see in supplements is 1,000 milligrams. Obviously, you can have multiple serves if you want to go higher, but it is just food for thought that even these super high ones are lower than things that a lot of people are just like naturally consuming through food as well.
Which is crazy. In terms of potassium and things like that, then should we run through some food amounts as well and what we typically think adequate?
Absolutely. You've already said how much people get, what the goal is and stuff like that.
Amazing. So I'll just remind you, so 2,600 to 3,400 milligrams a day. If we look at food sources, and it's funny because Aidan posted a video about this not long ago, people initially always think of bananas. If we're looking at other food sources, things like potato has around 900 milligrams of potassium, banana, a lot less than that, between 400 and 500. Things like avocado contain some potassium as well, beans, salmon, that sort of thing, but all less than a potato, which is 900 milligrams for a singular potato.
I'd basically say potassium comes from all of the core food groups. Like once you go deep down the rabbit hole, it's literally all the core food groups have it. And the way to get more potassium is typically to have more quote unquote healthy, nutrient-rich foods, less quote-unquote unhealthy, nutrient-poor foods. You could also make an argument that this also then ties a little bit back into calories, being if people have higher calories, typically they get more potassium. If they have lower calories, typically they get less, unless they're going out of their way to have like heaps of fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. Typically, electrolyte supplements have like 50 to 400 milligrams of potassium. I assume the Gatorade would fall into that range as well. Very few go much higher than that, and it's the reason because it is a risk if you have high-dose potassium supplementation. So it could be associated with a thing called hyperkalemia, which is dangerous, or it could just be a risk for GI issues, or if somebody has chronic kidney disease, that could be a risk. That risk is higher than you think because once people are above the age of 60, most people have some level of chronic kidney disease. So therefore, at a population level, it would be kind of risky to go super high-dose potassium in basically any supplement.
Cool. Magnesium. Let's chat about it. So again, the RDI of magnesium, we talk about it as in typical intakes, probably around that 300 to 450 milligrams a day. When we talk about supplements, normally the recommendation is not pushing it higher than 400 milligrams a day from supplements alone. Food sources, nuts, seeds, whole grains, legumes. Again, a lot of the foods that are whole grain or whole foods are high in magnesium.
And those are kind of like the recommended daily intake stuff you're talking about with those. Yeah, a lot of people fall like a little bit short of it. It's not massive. So like if I was looking at numbers that I've found, noting that these are obviously easy to debate, but like around 260 milligrams per day for women, around 320 milligrams per day for men. So they fall just like a little bit under it. I also use that as a bit of an argument for why so many people find some benefit from supplementing with it. You could either get there through food or you could supplement, but that makes sense. Most specific magnesium supplements are often in the 300 milligram plus type of range. If it's what we'd call a standard electrolyte supplement, it's often kind of low. So like 20 to 100 milligrams is what we'd be looking at from most of those supplements.
Calcium, lastly. So calcium, pretty obvious what food sources contain calcium, but dairy and fortified plant-based alternatives. Again, anything with bones in it, tofu, leafy greens, fortified foods. The RDI for calcium is 1,000 to 1,300 milligrams a day, depending on life stage and sex. People are, again, often falling short of this unless you're consciously making sure that you're getting enough calcium throughout the day.
Yeah, I saw like a number that was a little bit higher than I expected. So the average that I saw reported was 850 milligrams. Working with people, I wouldn't have picked it to be that high.
No, I think in clinic I see a lot less. And again, to give a bit of background, a cup of milk is around 300 milligrams. So you're probably needing to have, if we were just having cups of milk, 4 cups of milk or so a day to get to that level.
to the higher range for sure. Yeah. Like above the 850 or to the 1,000 plus. Yeah. 1,300. Yeah. And obviously many calcium supplementation, like calcium supplements by themselves, they aim for about 1,200 milligrams per day. Calcium's one of those ones where you can only absorb so much in a single sitting. So usually I recommend splitting it across the day. Most like electrolyte supplements have very little calcium, and this is just because it seems to be like less likely to be like linked with performance stuff than the other ones, or linked with the reasons people are having electrolyte supplements. Now, another interesting thing that I want to talk about is how much do we sweat out when exercising, particularly in relation to like different sweat rates and kind of testing. So per loss of litre of sweat, it typically looks like on average around 920 milligrams of sodium per hour, so almost 1,000, 200 milligrams for potassium, 15 milligrams for calcium, 1.3 milligrams for magnesium. So magnesium, very little goes out in sweat. Note that there is research showing that magnesium levels do drop during exercise, but it just doesn't seem to be due to sweat. Those are averages, huge individual variations. So some readings that I've seen have gone as high as 1,700 milligrams per hour plus for sodium, 400 milligrams for potassium, 120 milligrams for calcium, and 35 milligrams for magnesium. Note that, like I said, 1.3 milligrams on average for magnesium. Even the 35 milligrams, that's a huge, huge difference. But I think those numbers are interesting in relation to like how much we're trying to replete if we hypothetically were perfectly trying to match these numbers, which we don't need to perfectly match them because we have some stores of these things in our body as well.
And I think recent studies also say that if we're, again, given that there is such a massive individual variation, doing something like personalised sweat testing to actually be able to quantify these losses more accurately, even if we're using a range of loss of sodium or potassium or any other sort of electrolytes, it's important. So if anyone's not familiar with doing a sweat test is where you weigh yourself before exercise with no clothes and ideally after going to the toilet, exercise for, let's say we do 60 minutes, ideally at that race intensity in that condition, if possible. You track your fluid intake during the session if you have any, and then you weigh yourself again after that session without your clothes on to see what the difference is in body weight, which we then use to work out fluid loss, and then we can quantify that electrolyte loss as well.
Absolutely. So when is it worth supplementing? I might list some cases. So the first one is it depends on, are you able/likely to get stuff through food? So if you were very likely going to have a meal that has like a decent amount of sodium or like whatever, then maybe I wouldn't even worry about it. There are cases where that's less feasible. Like for example, if somebody's like fasting, particularly in the morning, then maybe they'd prefer an electrolyte supplement. Then a very common case I personally see is a lot of people, when they stand up, they feel lightheaded. They have sodium. They no longer have that issue. So theoretically, if somebody was like fasting and that was an issue they were facing, this could be an easy solution. The next one is if somebody was in a position where it likely mattered to them from an exercise perspective during exercise, because the muscle chef idea, great. Probably not going to have that in the middle of a marathon. So if somebody happened to be a saltier sweater, so to speak, like you could see some logic for that. Have you got other ones? We could talk about cramping or anything else.
Talk about cramping, but also just adding on to people getting dizzy. If you have got something like POTS or that sort of thing, obviously sodium can make a massive difference to those sort of symptoms. So then I would recommend supplementing then.
Do you want to add context? Because it's super high. It's super high what we'd recommend for that.
It's super high. So it's depending on individual tolerance, but pushing it for like up to 3,000 to, we could go 7,000, 8,000 milligrams of sodium per day is huge. But yeah. And that's mostly again with very high sodium electrolytes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's probably the easiest way to do it in many, many ways. So cramping, we've spoken about this on the podcast, and it is one where we know that if you went super low with some of these electrolytes, you can cause cramping. We have a lot of evidence on that. For example, one of the classic ones is they basically, like researchers, like put people in hot baths, made them sweat heaps, only gave them water, did that for a while until they cramped. Then they gave them salt, they stopped cramping. We have evidence that you can cause this. One of the things with like elite athletes and cramping though is it just seems like if you go through all of the details, they seem to be having similar electrolyte intake to those who are not cramping. They seem to have similar blood levels than those who are not cramping, so on and so forth. There are a lot of other variables in cramping beyond just this. What I would probably recommend doing is just covering your bases and having some level of electrolyte intake, both before and during. So let's say classic marathon runner, I'd probably have a breakfast that has a decent amount of electrolytes, you could add an electrolyte supplement on top of that, particularly if the breakfast was low in electrolytes. And then during, I'd probably have some as well. Like a standard recommendation I give is about 500 milligrams of sodium per hour. You go back to that sweat rate I was talking about before, how like per litre, people are typically like dropping close to 1,000 milligrams of sodium. Are they also sweating a litre per hour or whatever? I don't know. It's a complex thing to get into. You could also measure that too. But you don't need to match it perfectly because people have stores of sodium as well, which is part of why this seems to matter less. But I just think there's no downside of adding it beyond the money. So if you want to do it, it makes sense. I would probably, on top of that, have a small amount of potassium, a small amount of magnesium, and I wouldn't worry about calcium, but I'd have some of those coming in. It's hard to make an evidence-based case that this is actually moving the needle in many situations. The situations where it very clearly is if somebody's like done sweat testing and they turn out to be a higher than average, like salty sweater, they're going quite hard and they're doing it for definitely like over 4 hours. In that scenario, it makes way more sense. And the further you get from that, the less likely it is to matter, but you could still cover your bases if you want to as well.
And it's unlikely that athletes in that sort of scenario will replace all of their fluid losses. So even if we're getting a little bit extra in that you can hold on to a bit more fluid, that makes a lot of sense. I think another aspect of that then is that sodium does help reduce urinary output, like we've said. If you're doing a long endurance event, does it help that you're holding on to more fluid so you're not using the bathroom? I mean, that's just like another little extra factor that maybe you could consider there too. But very relevant because we know that more than 2% of a fluid loss from dehydration can impact performance.
Absolutely. And even on that, one little thing I add on to that is that I like that rule of thumb. There's a niche area that I would wager every single marathon world record ever, the people have lost more than 2% of body weight. So it's like, there is exceptions to this rule, but then the further you go, like let's say you go ultra marathon distance, I think people are less likely to keep going down that route because if they just got more and more and more dehydrated, it eventually impacts performance more and more and more. So it's like, it's worthwhile keeping that rule in mind as well. And if electrolytes, one, help you drink more water, which it can through two mechanisms. One of them is that sodium makes us thirsty, so it makes us want to have more. And then two, often these will have some form of flavoring that will make us want to drink more as well. And then two, if it makes you go to the bathroom less, like that'll help with all of this as well.
When do we not recommend supplements? Should we run through that as well?
Yeah, okay. So where do I start? Average office worker who doesn't do much exercise at all and also has a high sodium diet, probably don't recommend. Two, high blood pressure. Like this is a complicated one because a lot of other variables matter for blood pressure more than this. I even spoke earlier about how like high potassium matters more than the sodium thing. But I do come across people who have high blood pressure and are taking one of the high sodium supplements, and it's likely making their blood pressure worse. Some people would argue against that and point to this thing called sodium-mediated hypertension and say that only a certain percentage of people who have high blood pressure will have this thing called sodium-mediated hypertension, where their blood pressure is impacted by sodium. You go down that rabbit hole, huge percentage of people with high blood pressure fit into that category. And yes, there would be a percentage of people who what I've just said there may not be applicable to. The only way you can really find that out is a lot of trial and error yourself, where it's like high sodium intake one day, low sodium, high sodium, low sodium, see what happens to your blood pressure, do it like multiple times. Low key, I probably don't recommend doing that test because if you do have high blood pressure, I think it's borderline like unethical on my behalf for you to go and do that test because that is a risk. So like, I think it's just not worth adding a ton of sodium if you have high blood pressure. My own 2 cents.
I think that makes sense too. And then I guess in that category comes to, if we're looking at athletes specifically, if you're a high sweating endurance athlete, it makes sense to supplement. On the other hand, if you're doing strength program and you're an aircon at the gym, you might not need it either if you have a high enough sodium intake in your diet.
Cool. Okay, well, we will wrap up there. So this has been episode 243 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. As always, if you haven't already, if you could please leave a rating and review, we massively appreciate that. But apart from that, thank you for listening.